Thomas Jefferson, the president who doubled America 1801-1809. The Revolution of 1800. Jefferson's peaceful power shift. The election of 1800 unfolded like a national storm, rattling the fragile foundations of the early republic. Only 2 decades had passed since the Declaration of Independence. Yet America was already divided between warring political visions. Federalists warned that a Thomas Jefferson presidency would unleash chaos and violence, while Jefferson supporters accused John Adams' administration of sliding toward monarchy. The nation had never experienced a transfer of power between rival factions, and no one knew if the experiment of democracy would survive the test. When the votes were counted and then deadlocked, the country slipped into a 4-day constitutional crisis. In the halls of Congress, exhausted lawmakers braced for the possibility of street violence or even civil war. But after 36 ballots, Jefferson emerged as the nation's 3rd president, peacefully, legally, and without bloodshed, proving that political power could change hands without tearing the country apart. On March 4, 1801, Thomas Jefferson walked from his boarding house to the Capitol on foot, a symbolic rejection of pomp and power. He wore simple clothes, greeted ordinary citizens, and assured the nation that we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. The peaceful transfer of power became one of the greatest moments in early American history, a demonstration that Republican government could survive fierce elections and bitter rivalries. Jefferson's inauguration marked not only a change in leadership, but a shift in national philosophy. The new president promised to shrink government, restore simplicity, and defend civil liberties that many believed had eroded under Federalist rule. From his first day in office, Jefferson sought to transform the tone of American politics. He cut ceremonial displays, reduced the number of speeches, and insisted that the president was not a distant figure of royal grandeur, but the nation's chief public servant. Diplomats were greeted with handshakes rather than elaborate European etiquette. The cabinet met at a round table, without ranks or titles, symbolizing equality and Republican virtue. Washington City, still half wilderness, half mud streets, became the headquarters for a quieter, humbler federal government. Jefferson believed that the strength of the republic depended not on armies or taxes, but on the independence of its people and the restraint of those in power. The new administration immediately targeted the Federalist legacy. Jefferson moved to reverse the Alien and Sedition Acts, releasing those imprisoned for criticizing the government and urging Congress to pursue a more limited interpretation of federal authority. The narrator explains how Jefferson and his allies sought to undo what they saw as an era of overreach and attempt by the previous administration to police speech, centralize power, and elevate national institutions above citizen liberty. Jefferson believed deeply that a free people could govern themselves without constant federal intervention, and his presidency began with a sweeping effort to rebalance the relationship between the government and the governed. Yet the Revolution of 1800 was not simply a political victory. It was a cultural one. Jefferson represented the aspirations of farmers, craftsmen, immigrants, and frontier settlers who believed that America's destiny lay in expansion, opportunity, and personal freedom. His rise to power signaled that the young republic was moving away from the elite, urban commercial vision championed by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. In its place emerged a more populist, agrarian democracy, one that celebrated the farmer as the backbone of the nation and viewed government as a necessary but dangerous force that must always remain small, transparent, and accountable. Behind the scenes, however, Jefferson also inherited a nation still struggling to define itself. The federal courts were packed with Federalist judges, the Treasury burdened with growing debt, and the military dependent on funding that Jefferson planned to slash. Abroad, European empires watched America's internal battles with keen interest, measuring whether this experiment in Republican government would endure or collapse under its own contradictions. Jefferson knew that the success of his administration would set a precedent for centuries to come. shaping the balance between liberty and power for future generations. As Jefferson settled into the presidency, the narrator emphasizes that the true power of the Revolution of 1800 was not in the policies passed or the victories claimed, but in the message delivered to the world. A people divided by ideology had chosen ballots over bullets. A government born in revolution had shown it could survive passionate dissent without resorting to force. And a presidency that might have drifted toward monarchy instead turned deliberately toward humility, restraint, and democratic legitimacy. In an age when most nations changed rulers by violence, heredity, or conspiracy, America proved that freedom could coexist with order, and that political transformation did not require the collapse of institutions. Jefferson's arrival in power marked the beginning of one of the most transformative periods in American history, though controversies and contradictions would follow him throughout his presidency. His first act, peaceful, principled acceptance of authority, became a model for every transition that followed. The narrator concludes the chapter by reminding viewers that the Revolution of 1800 was not fought on battlefields or in streets, but in ideas, ballots, and the faith of a young nation that believed its Republican experiment was worth defending. Jefferson's presidency began with a quiet walk to the Capitol, but it set the United States on a course that would reshape the continent and define the meaning of democracy for generations. A president of simplicity, cutting government, controlling debt when Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801. He inherited a federal government that had grown far beyond what he believed the American Revolution intended. The Federalists had built a system of taxes, offices, and military structures designed to strengthen national authority. But to Jefferson, it looked dangerously similar to the centralized governments of Europe. He was determined to reverse course. From the moment he entered the presidency, he began reshaping the machinery of government. Guided by the belief that liberty flourished best when power remained small, simple, and directly accountable to the people, Jefferson's first target was the federal budget. The national debt had climbed 2 levels he considered unacceptable for a young republic. Debt, he argued, was a silent corruption pushing future generations to pay for the ambitions of the present. He and his Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, drew up a bold plan to slash expenses without damaging the government's essential functions. They believed that a republic must live within its means, just as a farmer or craftsman did. Every dollar saved was a dollar returned to the citizen. And so, one of the most aggressive budget cuts in American history began quietly. Inside Jefferson's modest candlelit office in Washington City, one of the largest expenses Jefferson targeted was the military. Federalists had built a substantial standing army, fearing foreign threats and internal rebellion. Jefferson believed a permanent army could become a tool of tyranny, and he feared that a powerful central military might someday be turned against the people themselves. So he reduced the army by nearly half and closed several military posts, replacing the vision of a large professional force with one of citizen militias ready to defend their states when necessary. His cuts were not universally popular. Critics warned he was leaving the nation exposed. Jefferson responded that the greatest safeguard for liberty was not an army in uniform, but an armed citizenry supported by a government that respected its own limits. Jefferson also set his sights on the Navy. The Federalists had built an expensive fleet, including enormous warships capable of matching the vessels of Europe. Jefferson admired the craftsmanship, but saw the cost as unsustainable. He halted construction of the giant ships and instead invested in small, agile gunboats, cheap vessels designed for coastal defense. These gunboats would become symbols of Jefferson's frugal approach, practical for defense, less threatening to liberty, and drastically cheaper to maintain. Whether wise or short-sighted, they reflected his unwavering belief that America should avoid entanglement in European wars and protect its shores without provoking foreign powers. Taxes became the next battlefield. Jefferson moved swiftly to eliminate all internal federal taxes, abolishing levies on whiskey, property, and daily goods. The only major federal revenue stream he left in place was the tariff on imported goods, which he believed was fairer and more efficient. The abolition of internal taxes had a powerful psychological impact. For ordinary Americans, the distant federal government suddenly felt less intrusive. Collectors who once patrolled frontier towns to enforce whiskey taxes were dismissed. Revenue offices closed. The federal presence shrank in both scope and spirit, reinforcing Jefferson's dream of a republic where citizens lived without constant oversight. As the government grew smaller, the narrator explains that Jefferson did not weaken the republic, he rebalanced it. Instead of expanding the executive branch, he relied heavily on the competence of a few trusted advisors and a small circle of administrators who shared his vision. Cabinet meetings were informal and often lively, held around a round table without rank or ceremony. Decisions were made through discussion, not hierarchy. Jefferson wanted his administration to represent the ideal American character: rational, moderate, and deeply suspicious of concentrated power. Washington City remained a quiet, almost rural capital, governed by simplicity rather than spectacle. Yet Jefferson's reforms also reshaped the relationship between citizens and their government. With fewer taxes and a reduced federal presence, Americans felt a new sense of independence. State governments regained influence. Farmers kept more of their earnings. Merchants navigated a more predictable economic landscape. Jefferson called this the Empire of Liberty, a nation strong not because it could coerce its people, but because it trusted them. He believed that the best government was the one that interfered least, and he structured his presidency to prove that such a government could be both moral and effective. The narrator notes that Jefferson's program was not without critics. Federalists accused him of weakening national defense and undermining the dignity of the presidency. Some warned that relying on tariffs for revenue was risky, leaving the nation vulnerable to trade disruptions. Others argued that his idealized vision of the independent yeoman farmer ignored the growing complexities of America's economy. Still, Jefferson never wavered. He believed he was restoring the republic to its proper foundation, one built not on bureaucracy or military might, but on the natural rights and everyday wisdom of its citizens. By the middle of his first term, Jefferson's financial program had achieved what many believed impossible. The national debt fell dramatically. The government operated at a surplus. Spending dropped without paralyzing the essential functions of the state. Jefferson wrote proudly that America had proven it could govern itself with moderation, discipline, and restraint, qualities he feared would vanish if the government grew too large or powerful. As the narrator brings the chapter toward its conclusion, the broader impact becomes clear. Jefferson's reforms did more than reduce taxes or shrink the army, they redefined the meaning of American government. The presidency became more accessible, more human, and less royal. Federal power became more limited, but not less capable. And the nation prepared itself for a future of expansion, prosperity, and challenges that Jefferson himself could not have predicted. The republic he shaped was lean, confident, and deeply rooted in the belief that free citizens were the true strength of the nation. Jefferson's commitment to simplicity laid the groundwork for one of the greatest turning points in American history and unexpected opportunity that would soon knock on the nation's door. As Europe convulsed in war and empires competed for control of the New World, a single diplomatic offer would arrive that would change everything. America was about to become a continental nation, and the foundations Jefferson built, frugal, stable, and principled, made that transformation possible. The chapter closes by reminding viewers that before America could double its size, it first had to redefine the meaning of power itself. And Thomas Jefferson's quiet revolution had done exactly that. The Louisiana Gamble, a deal that changes the world at the dawn of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. The vast Mississippi River Valley stood at the center of America's future. Farmers from Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley poured their harvests into the Mississippi, sending barrels of flour, pork, tobacco, and whiskey downstream to the port of New Orleans. Without access to that port, the western half of the nation would suffocate. Jefferson understood this with absolute clarity. He believed that whichever nation controlled New Orleans controlled America itself. And in 1802, a quiet diplomatic development in Europe threatened everything he had worked to build. For years, the port of New Orleans had been under Spanish control, weak, predictable, and generally cooperative. American farmers could store goods there and ship them abroad. But in a secret treaty known as the Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain handed Louisiana back to France. And France was no ordinary neighbor. In 1800, France was under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who dreamed of resurrecting a global empire stretching across the Atlantic. When Jefferson learned of the transfer, a chill swept through the government. The United States had never faced a more dangerous situation. Napoleon's armies dominated Europe. His fleets stalked the oceans. If France planted its flag in New Orleans, it could choke off the American West, ignite conflict, or even reclaim territory the United States already considered its own. Jefferson, usually calm and methodical, reacted with unusual urgency. He sent America's minister in Paris, Robert Livingston, on a mission filled with uncertainty. His instructions were simple but monumental. Secure American access to the Mississippi River, purchase New Orleans if possible, and avoid war at all costs. Livingston negotiated for months with little progress. Napoleon's ministers were evasive. Talk stalled. Tension rose. Jefferson, sensing the magnitude of the crisis, took a dramatic step by sending a special envoy, James Monroe, his trusted friend and political ally, a man whose judgment he trusted like no other. Monroe's arrival in Paris marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary diplomatic windows in history. What neither Monroe nor Livingston knew was that Napoleon's dreams were falling apart. A massive rebellion in Haiti, led by formerly enslaved men under Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines, shattered France's hopes of building a Caribbean empire. Disease devastated French forces. The Sugar Islands that Napoleon considered the jewel of his New World plans slipped from his grasp. Without Haiti, Louisiana lost its strategic value. And with war against Britain looming again, Napoleon needed money more than territory. In an astonishing reversal, he instructed his negotiators to offer not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territorial landmass stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. When the French ministers presented the offer, Livingston was stunned. The idea of purchasing land so vast, so unknown, so full of mystery and possibility seemed almost beyond imagination. It was nearly 828,000 square miles and empires worth of land, offered for a price that scarcely seemed real. James Monroe, fresh from his transatlantic voyage, arrived just in time to witness one of the most dramatic diplomatic moments in American history. Together, he and Livingston negotiated a price, $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre. Without waiting for Jefferson's permission, because the window could close at any moment, they signed the treaty. News of the purchase raced across the Atlantic and hit Washington like a thunderclap. Jefferson was thrilled, but also conflicted. He had always insisted on strict constitutional limits. The Constitution did not explicitly grant the president the power to buy new territory. Jefferson considered proposing an amendment to authorize the acquisition, but his advisors warned him that waiting risked losing the deal. In a moment of constitutional pragmatism that even his critics would later admire, Jefferson accepted that some actions must be taken for the nation's survival. He sent the treaty to the Senate, trusting that America's elected representatives would rise to the moment. After intense debate, they did. The treaty was approved. With a stroke of a pen, America doubled in size. The Louisiana Purchase transformed the nation from a fragile coastal republic into a continental power. The narrator explains that this single act reshaped the geography, economy, and destiny of the United States. The Mississippi River became a domestic artery. The frontier expanded beyond comprehension. New states would one day rise from the prairies, plains, and mountain valleys Jefferson had just claimed. The Purchase secured the dream of Western expansion and laid the groundwork for the idea of manifest destiny, though decades would pass before the phrase existed. Yet Jefferson understood that buying the land was only the beginning. Vast regions remained unmapped, unexplored, and inhabited by dozens of native nations with their own histories, alliances, and territories. If America was to claim the land responsibly, it needed knowledge, geographical, scientific, diplomatic. And so Jefferson launched one of the most ambitious expeditions in world history, the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether, Lewis, and William Clark. Their mission was to chart rivers, mountains, wildlife, and tribal relations, and to find a pathway to the Pacific Ocean. Their journey would become legendary. But in this chapter, their expedition is still only a glimmer in Jefferson's mind, an idea born from the need to understand the vast continent the United States had just inherited. The narrator emphasizes that the Louisiana Purchase was not merely a land acquisition, it was a philosophical and political triumph. It proved that diplomatic skill could change the fate of nations. It demonstrated that Jefferson's reduced government, balanced budget, and stable finances gave the United States the credibility to strike such a deal. And it showed the world that the American experiment was not fragile, it was expanding. But the Purchase also carried consequences. It intensified debates over slavery, as new territories raised new questions about freedom and bondage. It heightened diplomatic tensions with native nations, many of whom were not consulted about the sale of their homelands. And it made America's western horizon an arena of ambition, conflict, and possibility. Jefferson knew that he had opened a door to the future, but no one could predict exactly what lay on the other side. As the chapter closes, the narrator reflects on the magnitude of Jefferson's gamble. With courage, timing, and a stroke of geopolitical luck, he secured an empire. What began as a mission to buy a single city ended with the transformation of a nation. Jefferson's presidency, once centered on simplicity and restraint, suddenly became the engine of continental expansion. America would never be the same. And the world would soon learn that when the United States stepped onto the stage of global powers, it would do so not through conquest, but through one of the greatest diplomatic bargains in human history. Lewis and Clark. Into the great unknown, the Louisiana Purchase had transformed the map of the United States. But it did something even more profound. It opened a vast and mysterious continent to American curiosity. No one in Washington knew what truly lay beyond the Mississippi River. On paper, the Louisiana Territory stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border and westward to the Rocky Mountains. In reality, it was a world of uncharted rivers, towering peaks, endless plains, and ancient native nations whose histories reached back far before Europeans ever touched the continent. To Thomas Jefferson, knowledge was as essential as ownership. The United States had doubled in size, but without understanding the land or its people, the Purchase was only half complete. And so Jefferson prepared to send a small band of explorers into a wilderness larger than the entire nation itself. For years, Jefferson dreamed of such an expedition. As a young scholar and natural philosopher, he had collected books on geography, botany, and native languages. He had long imagined a scientific journey across the continent, even before the Louisiana Purchase made it a national priority. When the moment finally arrived, he chose as leader a man he trusted deeply, Meriwether Lewis, his personal secretary. A quiet but disciplined officer with a mind shaped by nature and a spirit sharpened by frontier experience. To balance Lewis's introspective temperament, Jefferson approved the appointment of William Clark, an experienced soldier and mapper. Together, Lewis and Clark would form a partnership that would join leadership with loyalty, science with survival, and ambition with caution. In the spring of 1804, the Corps of Discovery, nearly 4 dozen soldiers, hunters, interpreters, and laborers set off from St. Louis. The narrator follows their departure as a moment of almost mythical significance. They pushed their wooden keelboat up the Missouri River, venturing into lands few Americans had ever seen. Their mission was expansive: chart the geography, record new species, study weather patterns, make diplomatic contact with native nations, and search for a water route to the Pacific. They carried scientific instruments, trade goods, journals, weapons, and supplies. They also carried Jefferson's promise that the United States sought peace and knowledge, not conquest. As the corps moved upriver, they encountered a shifting world of landscapes and cultures. The first major native nation they met was the Osage, followed by the Oto and Missouri tribes. Diplomatic meetings were careful and essential. If the journey was to succeed, Lewis and Clark needed allies. The expedition also relied heavily on interpreters, including a French trader named Toussaint Charbonneau and his young wife, Sacagawea, Lemhi Shoshone woman, who would become one of the most important figures in American exploration. Though barely in her teens and carrying an infant son, she possessed knowledge of terrain, languages, and customs that the corps desperately needed. Her presence signaled peace to tribes encountered along the way and often saved the expedition from danger. The Missouri River grew wilder as they pressed westward. Powerful currents, hidden sandbars, sudden storms, and swarms of mosquitoes tested their endurance. They recorded plants and animals never before described by American science: pronghorn antelope, prairie dogs, grizzly bears, and countless species of birds and insects. Each night, the explorers wrote in their journals by firelight, detailing observations that would one day expand the world's understanding of North American wildlife. The narrator emphasizes that the journey was as much a scientific mission as a geographic one, and Jefferson eagerly awaited each new discovery. As summer turned to fall, the expedition reached the lands of the Teton Sioux, one of the most formidable tribes in the region. Diplomatic tensions rose immediately. A standoff at the riverbank nearly erupted into bloodshed, but careful negotiation eased the crisis. The corps continued north to winter with the Mandan and Hidatsa nations, whose Earth Lodge villages rose from the frozen plains like ancient fortresses. Here, in the icy Dakota winter, they built Fort Mandana's shelter of logs and mud-packed walls. It was during this long winter that Sacagawea gave birth to her son, Jean-Baptiste, whom the men affectionately called Pomp. The winter was harsh, but it was also a time of learning. The Mandan people taught the explorers about river routes, tribal alliances, and the lands beyond the Great Plains. In the spring of 1805, the corps set out once more, pushing deeper into territory no American had ever mapped. The towering Rocky Mountains soon appeared on the horizon like a barrier thrown by nature itself. Rivers split and braided into unknown paths. The grizzly bears grew more aggressive. The men grew lean from hunger and constant labor. Yet the most remarkable part of this leg of the journey was Sacagawea's reunion with her tribe. Deep in the mountain foothills, the corps encountered the Shoshone. In a twist of fate that borders on legend, Sacagawea recognized the Shoshone leader as her brother, Kamehameha. This moment of family rediscovery opened the way forward. Through these ties, the corps secured the horses they desperately needed to cross the Rocky Mountains. The mountain crossing nearly broke them. Snowfields, freezing nights, hunger, and exhaustion pushed the corps to their limits. But once they emerged on the western side, they found a new world of rivers and forests. They built canoes and journeyed down the Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia rivers, fighting rapids and whirlpools as they approached the Pacific Northwest. When they finally reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805, the moment was unforgettable. Standing on the edge of the continent, battered by wind and rain, they carved their names into a log and built Fort Clatsop to weather the winter. Their journals recorded the vast gray expanse of the Pacific America's new western horizon. The return journey, though faster, was no less perilous. The corps split into separate groups to explore new routes, map additional rivers, and gather more data. They reunited months later, scarred by hardship but driven by purpose. Finally, in September 1806, they arrived back in St. Louis to thunderous celebration. They had traveled nearly 8,000 miles. They had mapped the geography of a continent, created diplomatic ties, and cataloged more than 100 species unknown to American science. Most importantly, they had transformed the way the young nation imagined its future. As the narrator closes the chapter, the significance becomes unmistakable. The Lewis and Clark expedition was not merely an exploration. It was the first great American story of discovery. It expanded the nation's imagination, bridged cultural worlds, and laid the groundwork for future settlement, trade, and diplomacy. Jefferson's bold vision had succeeded, not through armies or conquest, but through knowledge, courage, and scientific curiosity. The West was no longer a blank space on a map, was a living, breathing world teeming with possibility. For the United States, the frontier had opened, and the path to the Pacific was no longer a dream, but a reality waiting to unfold. Struggles with the courts, Jefferson versus John Marshall. When Thomas Jefferson entered office in 1801, he inherited not only the presidency, but an uneasily balanced system of government whose boundaries were still undefined. The executive and legislative branches had changed hands peacefully in the Revolution of 1800. But the judiciary remained firmly in Federalist control, shielded from elections and empowered by lifetime appointments. At the center of this judicial empire stood Chief Justice John Marshall, a man whose intellect, ambition, and legal skill would soon collide with Jefferson's vision for America. Their struggle would determine not just the fate of the courts, but the meaning of the Constitution itself. The conflict began quietly. In the final hours of John Adams' presidency, the Federalists passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, creating new judgeships filled with Adams' loyal allies. These so-called midnight judges arrived at their posts with commissions signed, but not always delivered. When Jefferson took office, he discovered stacks of these undelivered papers. He saw them not as constitutional obligations, but as political traps laid by the outgoing administration. Jefferson instructed his Secretary of State, James Madison, to withhold several commissions. It was a seemingly small administrative decision that would ignite one of the most important court cases in American history. Among the men denied their commissions was William Marbury, a wealthy Federalist from Maryland. Outraged, he petitioned the Supreme Court to force the new administration to deliver his appointment. The case Marbury v. Madison placed the young nation on the edge of a constitutional cliff. If the court ordered Jefferson to deliver the commission, would the president comply? If he refused, what power did the court truly possess? The narrator highlights the tension of a government still learning how its branches could resist or restrain one another without unleashing a crisis. Inside the Supreme Court chamber, Chief Justice John Marshall crafted a decision of extraordinary subtlety. He declared that Marbury had a right to his commission and that Madison had violated the law by withholding it. But then came the turning point. Marshall ruled that the section of the Judiciary Act giving the court power to issue such orders was itself unconstitutional. In doing so, he denied Marbury his appointment, avoided a direct showdown with the executive branch, and simultaneously carved out a new and monumental power for the judiciary: the power of judicial review. The authority to strike down laws that violated the Constitution. When Jefferson read the decision, he understood its implications immediately. The judiciary had not been weakened, it had crowned itself the guardian of the Constitution. Marshall had preserved the balance of power in the immediate moment, but strengthened the court for generations to come. Jefferson, who believed the branches should interpret the Constitution independently, viewed judicial supremacy as dangerous. He warned that allowing judges to define the Constitution for the entire nation placed the republic at risk of the despotism of an oligarchy. Marshall, in contrast, believed that without a final interpreter, the Constitution would fracture into conflicting regional meanings. The struggle between these two giants did not end with Marbury v. Madison. Jefferson and his allies in Congress attempted to curb the influence of the Federalist judiciary. They repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801, abolishing some of the new judgeships. Federalists cried foul, accusing the Republicans of undermining judicial independence. Jefferson also supported an impeachment campaign against Justice Samuel Chase, a fiery Federalist who often let his political opinions bleed into his courtroom behavior. The impeachment trial gripped the nation. If Chase were removed for political bias rather than criminal acts, it would establish a dangerous precedent, one that could turn the judiciary into a partisan battleground. The Senate trial was dramatic, but ultimately stabilizing. Though Republicans held the majority, enough senators sided with moderation. Refusing to convict Chase, their votes preserved the principle that judges could not be removed simply for their political beliefs. The narrator emphasizes that this moment, though a defeat for Jefferson's immediate goals, helped solidify a critical foundation of American governance. The judiciary would remain independent, insulated from political retaliation and protected from the passions of the moment. Yet Jefferson and Marshall continued to duel indirectly through legal opinions and presidential policies. Jefferson argued that the Constitution was a living compact among the people, meant to be interpreted through democratic processes. Marshall insisted that its meaning must be anchored in legal principles that transcended elections. Their disagreement shaped debates about federal power, states' rights, and the scope of the judiciary for decades. Even when their personal correspondence remained civil, their philosophies stood worlds apart. Despite their rivalry, both men ultimately strengthened the republic in different ways. Jefferson expanded liberty by restraining federal intrusion and empowering citizens. Marshall strengthened stability by constructing a judiciary capable of balancing the other branches. Together, though often in opposition, they ensured that America's constitutional system would endure political storms without breaking. Their conflict became a testament to the resilience of the American experiment, demonstrating that disagreement at the highest levels could sharpen, rather than shatter, the foundations of government. The chapter closes by reflecting on the paradox Jefferson faced. He had come to Washington determined to limit centralized power, yet he witnessed the judiciary assert itself as a co-equal branch with broad authority. But he also recognized that an independent judiciary could protect liberties he valued deeply. Meanwhile, Marshall had succeeded in elevating the Supreme Court's role. But he did so in a way that avoided open conflict with the president. Both men shaped the Constitution not through amendments or force, but through ideas, and ideas, once unleashed, became the true architecture of American governance. In the end, the clash between Jefferson and Marshall was not a battle for control, but a negotiation for balance. Their rivalry defined the boundaries of power, clarified the meaning of the Constitution, and ensured that no branch, executive, legislative, or judicial, would stand above the others. It remains one of the most consequential struggles in the nation's early history. A reminder that democracy does not survive because leaders agree, but because institutions are strong enough to withstand the friction of competing visions. The Barbary War, America's first overseas fight at the start of Thomas Jefferson's presidency. The United States was a young nation surrounded by powerful empires, unpredictable allies, and dangerous seas. Nowhere were these dangers more evident than in the Mediterranean, where the Barbary states Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis, and Morocco controlled vast networks of piracy. For decades, these North African rulers demanded tribute from nations that wished to trade safely in their waters. European powers paid the tribute and passed the cost on to merchants. And because the United States no longer enjoyed the protection of the British Navy after independence, American ships became easy prey. Captains were captured, sailors enslaved, and cargoes stolen. By 1801, piracy was bleeding American commerce and challenging the very sovereignty of the young republic. Jefferson had long opposed paying tribute. As a diplomat in the 1780s, he argued that giving money to pirates only encouraged further demands. But the United States in those early years had no navy strong enough to confront the Barbary states. By the time he became president, however, Jefferson had a fleet even, if modest, of newly built frigates, among them the USS Constitution and the USS Philadelphia. He believed that the time had come to defend American honor and protect American sailors. The narrator explains that Jefferson's decision to resist the Barbary rulers was as much a moral statement as a strategic one. The United States would not be a nation that bowed to extortion. In May 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli, demanded increased tribute from the United States. When Jefferson refused, the Pasha cut down the flagpole at the American consulate, a clear declaration of war. Jefferson responded with unprecedented resolve. He ordered a squadron of American warships to sail across the Atlantic, beginning the United States' first military action on foreign shores. It was a risky move. Many still doubted the strength of the Navy after Jefferson's earlier reductions, and critics warned that the United States was venturing into a conflict far from home. But Jefferson believed that a republic must defend its rights with firmness, not fear. The American squadron arrived in the Mediterranean and quickly imposed a naval blockade on Tripoli. The narrator brings viewers onto the decks of the frigates as they chased pirate corsairs, seized enemy ships, and confronted stormy seas. The blockade tested the endurance of American sailors who had never fought a long naval campaign so far from home. But it also demonstrated the growing professionalism of the U.S. Navy. Under the command of Commodores Richard Dale and later Edward Preble, American ships patrolled the coast with precision, slowly tightening the pressure on Tripoli. Then, in the fall of 1803, disaster struck. The USS Philadelphia, one of the Navy's most powerful frigates, ran aground on an uncharted reef while pursuing a Tripolitan vessel. Surrounded by enemy gunboats and unable to maneuver, the ship was captured intact. Its crew was taken prisoner, and the Philadelphia itself was towed into Tripoli's harbor, a massive warship turned trophy for the Pasha. For Jefferson and the Navy, the loss was catastrophic. A single captured frigate threatened to shift the balance of power and embolden America's enemies. But the setback set the stage for one of the most daring operations in U.S. naval history. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, a young officer known for his boldness, volunteered to lead a nighttime raid to destroy the captured Philadelphia before the enemy could use it. Under the cover of darkness, Decatur and a small crew sailed a disguised vessel into Tripoli harbor, approached the Philadelphia as if seeking shelter, and then stormed aboard with knives and pistols. They overwhelmed the guards, set the ship ablaze, and escaped as flames lit the night sky. British Admiral Horatio Nelson called it the most bold and daring act of the age. For Americans, it was a moment of national pride, a sign that their young Navy was capable of extraordinary bravery. The war continued, the American forces intensifying their blockade and launching bombardments against Tripoli's fortifications. Yet Jefferson believed the conflict could not be won by naval pressure alone. He authorized a bold land campaign led by naval agent William Eaton, who sought to restore the Pasha's exiled brother, Hamid Karamanli, to the throne of Tripoli. Eaton assembled a diverse force of U.S. Marines, Arab fighters, and mercenaries and marched them across 500 miles of desert from Egypt to the coastal city of Derna. The grueling journey tested the limits of endurance, but it culminated in a stunning victory. Eaton's forces stormed Derna, raising the American flag in triumph. It was the first time the U.S. flag flew in victory on foreign soil. The capture of Derna brought Tripoli to the negotiating table. In 1805, the Pasha agreed to a treaty. American prisoners were released. Tribute payments were reduced or eliminated, and the United States secured its right to trade freely without fear of piracy. Jefferson's gamble had paid off. The narrator explains that this victory was more than a diplomatic success, marked a turning point in American foreign policy. The United States had proven that it could project power overseas, defend its interests, and stand firm against extortion even when facing distant enemies. Yet the war also exposed the limits of Jefferson's earlier naval reductions. The small gunboats he promoted were useful for coastal defense, but inadequate for distant conflicts. The frigates he once viewed as extravagant had become essential tools of American power. Jefferson, to his credit, recognized the lesson. Over time, he supported a more balanced approach to naval strength, acknowledging that a young nation growing in global commerce needed a fleet capable of protecting its interests. The Barbary War left a lasting legacy. It strengthened the U.S. Navy, elevated figures like Stephen Decatur to national heroes, and established the Marine Corps' reputation. Celebrated in their motto "To the shores of Tripoli," it signaled that the United States would not shrink from international challenges, but it also revealed the complexities of using military force to shape foreign affairs, a balance Jefferson would continue to navigate throughout his presidency. As the narrator closes the chapter, the significance becomes clear. Jefferson had entered office committed to peace, frugality, and limited government. Yet, global realities forced him to assert American power in ways no president before him had attempted. The Barbary War became a defining early test of whether the United States could defend its commerce and its citizens in an unpredictable world. Through a combination of diplomacy, naval might, and audacity, Jefferson proved that it could. And in doing so, he propelled the young nation onto the global stage, tentatively, reluctantly, but unmistakably, ready to defend its place among the powers of the world. America's economy transformed. Farmers, factories, and a growing West. When Thomas Jefferson looked out across the United States, he saw a nation of farmers. To him, the independent yeoman farmer, self-sufficient, virtuous, and deeply connected to the land, represented the purest expression of Republican freedom. A republic, he believed, depended on citizens who could think for themselves and were not dependent on monarchs, bankers, or employers for their survival. His presidency embraced this vision wholeheartedly. But as the narrator reveals, the American economy was already changing beneath Jefferson's feet. New markets, new machines, new lands, and new pressures were quietly reshaping the nation. What Jefferson celebrated as a simple agrarian society was rapidly becoming something far more complex. The Louisiana Purchase opened millions of acres for settlement, and the lure of cheap, fertile land captured the imagination of thousands. Families from Virginia, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, and New England packed their belongings into wagons and headed west. They crossed mountains, rivers, and forests, carving new communities out of the frontier. Jefferson's land policies encouraged this movement. He championed the Land Act of 1804, which simplified the process of buying federal land, making it easier for ordinary Americans to become landowners. In Jefferson's mind, widespread land ownership strengthened the republic by giving citizens a personal stake in its survival. But the narrator explains that Western expansion brought both opportunity and tension. New states like Ohio emerged out of the expanding frontier, bringing new voices into the Union and shifting political power westward. Yet this growth also deepened the divide over slavery. The fertile lands of the Deep South promised immense profits for cotton growers, especially after Eli Whitney's cotton gin transformed cotton into the engine of the Southern economy. Plantations expanded, enslaved labor increased, and the contradiction between Jefferson's ideals of liberty and the realities of American slavery grew sharper. In the North, where rocky soil limited large-scale farming, a different economic transformation was underway. Though Jefferson imagined America as an agrarian paradise, the seeds of industrialization were already taking root. Water-powered mills in New England began weaving cloth and grinding grain. Inventors developed new machines that increased productivity and created factory-style labor. Roads and turnpikes multiplied, knitting together communities and opening new routes for trade. The narrator highlights that Jefferson, despite his reservations about manufacturing, recognized its growing importance. He supported improvements to infrastructure, including canals and road systems that connected distant markets and strengthened the national economy. The westward expansion also reshaped America's relationship with its indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries. Jefferson believed that native nations could either integrate into American society or migrate westward beyond the reach of settlers. He proposed cultural exchange, farming instruction, and diplomacy, hoping to avoid the conflicts that had marked earlier decades. But the pressure of expansion made tension inevitable. As settlers claimed more land, native communities faced displacement, broken treaties, and growing conflict. The narrator emphasizes that while Jefferson preferred peaceful coexistence in theory, his vision of an expanding republic left native nations with shrinking space in which to preserve their independence. Meanwhile, the economy itself was becoming more interconnected. The Mississippi River evolved into a commercial superhighway, carrying goods from the interior to New Orleans and beyond. Merchant ships carried American grain, tobacco, timber, and cotton to global markets. Jefferson's embargo against Britain and France, though deeply unpopular and economically damaging also, revealed how dependent the nation had become on international trade. America was no longer an isolated agricultural society. It was a rising commercial nation with global ties and global vulnerabilities. Despite these challenges, Jefferson's presidency fostered remarkable growth. Population expanded rapidly. New towns emerged almost overnight. Markets widened. Innovation accelerated. Families, drawn by the promise of land and opportunity, spread across regions once considered remote wilderness. The Jeffersonian dream of a republic of farmers was real. But it was unfolding in a world shaped by commerce, industry, and international pressures that no president could fully control. The narrator underscores that Jefferson's economic vision contained contradictions that would echo through American history. He championed limited government, yet used federal power to acquire vast new territories. He celebrated small farmers, yet presided over the expansion of plantation slavery. He distrusted centralized economic power, yet recognized the need for national infrastructure and stable finances. Jefferson's policies supporting westward expansion, simplifying land sales, stabilizing federal debt, and promoting trade-fueled growth, but they also created tensions that future generations would have to confront. By 1809, when Jefferson prepared to leave office, the American economy was no longer the same nation he had inherited 8 years earlier. The population had surged. The frontier had moved hundreds of miles westward. Cotton dominated southern exports. Northern factories were emerging. Rivers, canals, and roads formed the early foundations of a national transportation network. And the country had begun to see itself not merely as a cluster of states along the Atlantic, but as a continental power with economic ambitions stretching from ocean to ocean. The chapter closes by reflecting on the silent transformation Jefferson helped unleash. His belief in the Empire of Liberty inspired millions to seek land, independence, and opportunity. Yet the economic forces that shaped the early 1800s industrial growth, slavery's expansion, and Western migration would collide in the decades ahead, generating conflicts Jefferson could not foresee. America was growing stronger, wealthier, and more expansive, but also more divided. The Jeffersonian vision endured, but the American economy was becoming something larger, more dynamic, and more difficult to control. The seeds of the nation's future triumphs and tragedies were growing together in the same soil. The slave paradox, Jefferson's legacy of liberty and contradiction. The United States in the early 1800s was a nation built on ideals of liberty, equality, and natural rights principles Thomas Jefferson himself had helped define. Yet beneath those soaring words lay a harsh and painful reality. Millions of people lived their lives in bondage, denied the very freedoms that formed the moral foundation of the Republic. And no figure embodied this contradiction more profoundly than Jefferson himself. The narrator begins with this unavoidable truth. The author of the Declaration of Independence, a man who spoke passionately about human rights, remained deeply entangled with the institution of slavery throughout his life. Jefferson believed slavery was morally wrong. He wrote that it violated the natural order and corrupted both master and enslaved. He called it a moral depravity and feared it would bring divine judgment upon the nation. Yet he also lived in a society whose economy, especially in the South, was inseparable from enslaved labor. At Monticello, his own Virginia plantation, over 100 enslaved men, women, and children lived and worked, maintaining the household, growing crops, crafting goods, and sustaining the estate that enabled Jefferson's political career. This contrast between belief and reality became one of the central dilemmas of his life. The narrator guides viewers into that contradiction, explaining how Jefferson justified his position in a world that he believed was not yet ready for full emancipation. He envisioned a gradual end to slavery, predicting that the institution would eventually collapse under its own injustices. He proposed plans for voluntary emancipation paired with resettlement outside the United States, ideas shaped by the racial tensions and social fears of his era. But these proposals remained theoretical. In practice, Jefferson rarely freed the enslaved people he owned, and the plantation economy that surrounded him only grew stronger during his lifetime. The growth of cotton transformed everything. With the invention of the cotton gin, cotton cultivation exploded across the Deep South. Enslaved labor became even more valuable, and new territories opened by the Louisiana Purchase offered vast new lands for plantation agriculture. Jefferson hoped Western expansion would create a nation of small, independent farmers. But instead, it strengthened the spread of slavery into regions where it had not existed before. The frontier that symbolized hope and opportunity for white settlers became a region of deeper entrenchment for enslaved people, forced westward in chains. Jefferson's own policies reflected this complicated reality. In 1807, he signed a law banning the international slave trade, ending the importation of enslaved Africans into the United States. It was one of the most significant anti-slavery measures of the early republic. The narrator emphasizes that Jefferson saw this as a moral victory, an essential step toward limiting the institution's growth. Yet the ban did not end slavery itself. Domestic trade continued, and the enslaved population grew through childbirth, not immigration. The internal slave trade became even more profitable as cotton spread across the South. The narrator explores how Jefferson's writings shaped national debates for decades to come. On one hand, his words in the Declaration inspired abolitionists, reformers, and generations of Americans who saw liberty as a universal right. On the other hand, his theories about race, written in the Notes on the State of Virginia, reflected the prejudices of his time and gave ammunition to those who defended slavery as a natural or necessary institution. His legacy became a battleground where competing visions of America, one rooted in freedom, the other in inequality, clashed and collided. At Monticello, the contradiction was visible in everyday life. Jefferson relied on skilled black craftsmen, cooks, gardeners, and builders whose labor sustained the estate. Many were highly trained and deeply knowledgeable in agriculture, trades, and crafts. The narrator highlights that these individuals lived under constant restrictions, controlled by laws that denied them autonomy. Yet they became central to Monticello's operations and Jefferson's personal comfort. In this environment, human relationships were shaped by unequal power, blending familiarity with oppression and creating moral complexities that later generations would struggle to understand. Jefferson's family, too, was deeply connected to the enslaved community. The Hemings family, whose members were enslaved at Monticello, lived lives interwoven with Jefferson's own household. The documentary avoids unnecessary detail. The narrator acknowledges that historians widely accept that Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman. Their lives and experiences stand as stark reminders of how deeply slavery permeated even the most private corners of early 60s. Only Rubicus has the luxurious texture that glides on. This most totality is the long-lasting screech, and leaves a rich, long-lasting screeded, long-lasting color. Their lives and experience, my lies, my life, my lies, my lies, my lies, is it, my life. My lies may sieve, my lies, my live, I see. Defly, caside, paride, cat-ad, I sow it. Garide of Soet, it's Soed. Kalai li like, guy sit pi sai sai, sick it guy sits its ibs, bit to the at cruise to the cuts to its say. Like sit at Rebus ace it is the specific American society. These stories show the personal realities behind Jefferson's public contradictions. As Jefferson aged, his letters revealed increasing anxiety about the future of the nation. He feared that slavery was a fire bell in the night, an unsolvable crisis that threatened to tear the Union apart. He predicted conflict between North and South if the issue was not addressed gradually and peacefully. Yet even with this foresight, he took few practical steps to change the system during his presidency. His cautious approach reflected a man caught between ideals and fears, principles and politics, hope and resignation. The narrator explains that Jefferson's paradox became America's paradox. A nation founded on liberty expanded its borders while expanding slavery. A people who celebrated independence denied it to others. Jefferson's era set the stage for future battles, legal, moral, and ultimately military, that would define the next century. The same expansion that made America a continental power also forced the nation to confront the question it tried hardest to avoid, whether it could remain both free and divided by slavery. As the chapter closes, the narrator reflects on Jefferson not to condemn or excuse him, but to understand the complexity of his time and legacy. Jefferson helped craft the language of American freedom, yet lived a life shaped by an institution that denied freedom to many. His achievements were immense: diplomat, thinker, president, visionary, but his contradictions were equally immense. America's journey toward justice would be shaped not only by his ideals, but by the gaps between those ideals and his actions. The United States would continue to grapple with this paradox long after Jefferson's presidency ended. And as the next chapters reveal, the pressures of international conflict would soon push Jefferson into decisions that tested the nation's economy, diplomacy, and resolve, forcing America to confront challenges that would lead directly to the next great turning point in its history. The road to tension, Britain, France, and Jefferson's embargo. The early 1800s found the United States caught in the crossfire of a global struggle it had no power to control. Across the Atlantic, Britain and France, two giants, locked in a titanic war, battling for dominance of Europe. Their conflict spilled onto the seas, where merchant ships became pawns in a worldwide contest for power. The United States, a young nation built on trade, suddenly found its vessels seized, its sailors detained, and its neutrality challenged at every turn. As the narrator explains, Thomas Jefferson entered his second term, facing a storm he could neither escape nor ignore. American merchant ships traveled across the world, carrying cotton, tobacco, grain, and timber to European markets. But Britain and France each sought to choke the other by restricting neutral trade. Napoleon's continental system banned European nations from buying British goods. Britain retaliated with orders in council, requiring all ships trading in Europe to stop in British ports for inspection. American ships caught between these rival decrees were seized, sometimes by the British Navy, sometimes by French privateers. What made matters worse was Britain's practice of impressment, the forced capture of sailors accused of being British deserters. In reality, many impressed sailors were American citizens taken from their ships and compelled to serve on British war vessels. Each incident outraged the public and challenged Jefferson's patience. The most shocking event came in 1807, when the British warship HMS Leopard stopped the American frigate Chesapeake off the coast of Virginia. When the Chesapeake refused to allow a search for deserters, the Leopard opened fire, killing and wounding several American sailors. The British boarded the battered vessel and seized 4 men. News of the attack raced across the nation. Jefferson, usually calm and philosophical, called it an act of aggression that struck at the sovereignty of the United States. Crowds demanded war. Newspapers filled with fiery headlines. For the first time since the Revolution, Americans seriously considered taking up arms against Britain again. But Jefferson hesitated. The United States was not ready for war. Its army was small. Its navy had only a handful of powerful ships. The nation was vast but underpopulated, with long borders impossible to defend. Jefferson feared that war would drain the treasury, weaken the fragile Union, and risk the independence he had fought so hard to maintain. The narrator explains that Jefferson believed the best weapon against European empires was not force, but economic pressure. If the United States cut off trade, he reasoned, Britain and France would feel the loss of American goods and be forced to respect American neutrality. And so, Jefferson turned to a bold, controversial experiment in economic warfare: the Embargo Act of 1807. The embargo prohibited American ships from leaving port for any foreign destination. No matter the cargo, no matter the destination, no ship could sail. The idea was simple: life. America removed itself from the contest. Neither Britain nor France could violate its rights. But the consequences were far more disruptive than Jefferson imagined. The narrator walks the viewer through the shockwave that followed. Ships rotted at harbor. Merchants went bankrupt. Fishermen hung their nets in frustration. Farmers watched their harvests pile up unsold. Smuggling exploded along the Canadian border. American streets that once bustled with maritime commerce fell silent. New England, whose livelihood depended on shipping, became the center of anger. Critics accused Jefferson of sacrificing the economy on the altar of his ideals. They held public meetings, wrote scathing editorials, and argued that the embargo hurt the United States far more than Britain or France. Jefferson's opponents called the policy a form of peaceable coercion, a strategy that relied on economic pressure instead of guns, but one that failed to account for the stubbornness of the European powers. Britain simply found new markets. Napoleon applauded the embargo publicly, but exploited it privately. Enforcing the embargo required measures Jefferson found deeply uncomfortable. The federal government expanded surveillance of ports. Custom officials gained new authority. Jefferson approved laws that strengthened enforcement and punished smugglers more severely. These actions ran counter to his lifelong suspicion of government overreach. The narrator highlights the irony. Jefferson, who had once celebrated minimal federal power, now oversaw some of the most intrusive economic restrictions in American history. Despite his efforts, the embargo failed to change the behavior of Britain or France. The European powers barely felt its impact, while American citizens felt it every day. By the time Jefferson's presidency neared its end, even many of his supporters recognized that the policy had become politically and economically unsustainable. Jefferson reluctantly acknowledged the experiment had run its course. On his final days in office, he signed the Non-Intercourse Act, which lifted the embargo on all nations except Britain and France. It was a partial retreat, a recognition that economic coercion had limits the young republic had not fully understood. The narrator reflects on the personal toll the embargo took on Jefferson. He had risen to power, promising peace, prosperity, and reduced government. Now he concluded his presidency weighed down by public anger and national hardship. His dream of protecting American neutrality without sacrificing American principles had collided with the realities of global conflict. And yet, Jefferson never abandoned his belief that war should be the last resort. He had seen too much of its cost during the Revolution to risk the nation he helped build. As historians look back, the embargo stands as one of the most debated decisions of Jefferson's presidency. Some view it as a courageous attempt to preserve peace through nonviolent means. Others see it as a strategic miscalculation that crippled the economy. In truth, it revealed the vulnerability of a young nation caught between empires, struggling to protect its place in the world without surrendering its ideals. It showed how difficult neutrality could be in an era when global powers viewed commerce as a weapon. The chapter closes with a somber but reflective tone. The United States emerged from the embargo wounded but wiser. It learned that independence required not only courage, but economic strength, military strength, and political unity. Jefferson's presidency, once defined by expansion and optimism, ended in tension and fatigue. Yet even in failure, the embargo shaped the nation's future, setting the stage for the War of 1812 and teaching the next generation of leaders that the price of peace could sometimes be as heavy as the burden of war. Jefferson leaves the stage, a nation transformed. When Thomas Jefferson rose to leave the presidency in March 1809, he stepped away from a nation dramatically different from the one he had inherited 8 years earlier. What began as a hopeful experiment in limited government had become one of the most transformative periods in early American history. The narrator opens with Jefferson, now older, quieter, and carrying the weight of decisions that had reshaped a continent. He arrived in office promising simplicity and peace. He departed at the helm of a vastly expanded republic, strained by foreign pressures, but strengthened by a newfound sense of identity and ambition. The United States Jefferson inherited was confined largely to the east of the Mississippi River, bordered by powerful empires and overshadowed by the conflicts of Europe. The United States he left behind stretched across a vast interior, its borders pushed outward by the Louisiana Purchase, its imagination stirred by the Lewis and Clark expedition, and its citizens increasingly confident that their nation was destined for greatness. Jefferson's presidency had not only doubled the size of the country, had doubled its sense of possibility. But Jefferson's final years in office were marked by exhaustion and controversy. The Embargo Act, designed to keep the nation out of war, had instead boxed America into economic hardship. The narrator explains that Jefferson felt surrounded by foreign threats and domestic criticism in a way he had not anticipated. Newspapers that once praised him now questioned his judgment. Merchants demanded relief. States challenged federal authority. The political harmony Jefferson envisioned in 1801 seemed a distant memory. Yet even amid criticism, he remained steadfast in his belief that war should be avoided, that liberty should be preserved, and that the Republic was strong enough to weather the storm. As Jefferson prepared to depart, he reflected on the achievements and contradictions of his presidency. He had cut taxes, reduced the national debt, shrunk the military, and simplified the government. But circumstances had tested those principles. The Barbary War forced him to project American power overseas. The Louisiana Purchase required him to adopt a flexible interpretation of the Constitution he once read so strictly. And the embargo forced him to rely on government enforcement far beyond what he had once believed necessary. The narrator highlights that Jefferson's presidency became a balancing act between ideals and realities, philosophy and pragmatism, hopes and fears. Yet through all these challenges, Jefferson never lost faith in the resilience of the American Republic. He believed the nation's strength was rooted not in armies or wealth, but in the character of its people. He trusted citizens to correct errors, change policies, and renew the spirit of self-government. When he left office, he did so voluntarily and peacefully, reinforcing the precedent he had helped establish 8 years earlier that power, in a republic, belongs not to the individual, but to the people who grant it. Jefferson's departure also marked the rise of a new generation of leaders. His close ally and friend, James Madison, succeeded him as the fourth president. The narrator explains that Madison inherited both the promise and the problems Jefferson left behind: a vast new territory ripe for settlement, a nation more confident than ever, but also a diplomatic crisis that would soon push the United States toward the War of 1812. Jefferson believed Madison had the intellectual depth and moral steadiness to guide the nation through the turmoil. He placed the future in Madison's hands with trust and loyalty born from decades of collaboration. Leaving Washington, Jefferson returned to Monticello, the hilltop home that had always been his refuge. After years of public service, the quiet hum of plantation life offered familiar comfort. Yet Monticello itself embodied Jefferson's paradox: a place of beauty, creativity, and learning sustained by the labor of enslaved workers whose lives he controlled. The narrator notes that as Jefferson resumed life as a private citizen, the contradiction between his ideals and his reality continued to shadow his legacy. At Monticello, Jefferson devoted himself to writing, architecture, agriculture, and education. His greatest post-presidential project was the founding of the University of Virginia, a vision of public education built on the belief that a republic must be guided by an informed citizenry. Jefferson designed the buildings, planned the curriculum, and selected the faculty. He wanted the university to be a place where free inquiry could flourish, where the next generation of Americans would learn not what to think, but how to think. He considered this achievement, alongside the Declaration of Independence and the Statute for Religious Freedom, one of the three greatest contributions of his life. Even as he withdrew from politics, Jefferson remained a powerful symbol. Visitors traveled long distances to meet him, seeking wisdom from the man who had shaped the nation's founding ideals. He answered hundreds of letters, offering guidance on philosophy, science, liberty, and government. But he rarely spoke of returning to power. The narrator emphasizes that Jefferson believed leaders should know when to step aside, allowing others to carry forward the work of the Republic. In his final years, Jefferson watched a nation he had helped build grow larger, stronger, and more confident. Yet he also saw the seeds of future conflict. The debate over slavery deepened. Tensions between North and South sharpened. The expansion he had championed brought opportunity for many, but struggle for others, especially native nations whose lands were increasingly encroached upon. Jefferson sensed that the future would test the country in ways even he could not fully foresee. As the chapter closes, the narrator reflects on Jefferson's exit from the presidency as a moment of transformation, not just for one man, but for the entire nation. He had entered office advocating restraint, peace, and simplicity. He left having reshaped the geography of America, strengthened its standing abroad, expanded its scientific horizons, and challenged its moral conscience. His presidency was a mosaic of brilliance and contradiction, visionary triumphs and imperfect choices. Jefferson left the stage quietly, riding away from Washington without ceremony. But the nation he shaped would continue walking the path he helped lay toward expansion, toward discovery, and toward the ongoing struggle to live up to the ideals he had articulated. The United States he left behind was not yet the country of its highest promises, but it was a nation transformed, a nation rising, a nation ready for the century ahead.